Well, here I am again, introducing a speaker who is a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Feinmen, our own vice president. Peter and I are sort of from the dinosaur age, as he likes to call it, that is, speakers who still use slides. But he has now entered the 21st century PowerPoint age, and no longer needs to borrow slides from me, nor ask me to make slides for him. So now I've been left with the dinosaurs. Although they're proving very popular right now, as you might have heard, with one of the largest grossing films in Hollywood history, right after the Avengers. It's called Jurassic World. Peter and I also have a non-Egyptian connection, and that is to the world of L. Frank Baum, author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, because of Peter's interest in central New York history. In fact, he writes a weekly column for New York History magazine and advocates on behalf of local history in New York State. That interest includes, or has included, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, the well-known suffragette, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. The trio lived in Gage's 1850s home in Fayetteville, New York, near Syracuse, while writing their opus on women's suffrage. It has now been completely restored and is the headquarters of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation, founded by Sally Roche Wagner. Gage's daughter, Maud, married Baum in the parlor of the house in 1892, and it was Gage, a member of the Theosophical Society, who urged the couple to take a trip to Egypt. In fact, she fancied herself a priestess of Atlantis in another life, and Maud herself thought she was Queen Hatshepsut in another life. Some of you may recall that about 2 years ago, I presented a slide lecture, my last hurrah, so to speak, on the Baum's 1906 Grand Tour of Egypt. In it, Maud noted in a letter home that the columns on her old home in Fayetteville resembled those in the tombs at Beni Hassan. In fact, I showed both the house and the tombs in my lecture. It was also Gage who urged her son-in-law to write down his stories about the land of Oz that he often told his 4 sons. Now, Peter has met Sally Wagner and suggested to her that teacher programs could be created at the house, using each room to tell a separate story. For example, the women's rights room, the Underground Railroad room, in fact, it was a station on the railroad before the Civil War, the Mohawk Indian Nation room, who adopted Matilda into their wolf clan, and the Oz room, the parlor where Baum and his wife were married. Apropos of tonight's lecture, Peter has suggested that, quote, Baum's Oz is a story of trauma that involves the forces of chaos versus harmony, although we Americans tend to focus on good and evil. Furthermore, he says that, quote, water also proves to be a powerful agent, with a bucket for Dorothy serving instead of a flood for Moses or the Assyrian kings. As to Peter's credits, which are listed on the lecture notice you received, I'll just mention that he is the founder and president of the Institute of History, Archaeology, and Education. He received his professional degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, New York University, and Columbia University. His upcoming publications include an essay in the Egyptological Seminar of New York's Best Journal, soon to be published, we hope, Festschrift for Dorothea Arnold. He has also authored a forthcoming book, Who Wrote the Bible? The Sons of Jay and Jerusalem Throne Games. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Peter Feinmen with his topic, Cosmic Trauma, Assyria, and Egypt's 9/11.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you, David. Let's see, Oz, dinosaurs, and Atlantis. Not the introduction I normally expected, but thank you very much, and I'll try to see if I can keep it going. So the lecture is Cosmic Trauma, Assyria and Egypt's 9/11. And the abstract that I submitted, can all of you read this from the back? If it's a little difficult, but this is what I said I was going to do. What is the center of your universe? Has it been violated? How do you cope if it has? These questions can be raised for peoples, cultures, and countries, as well as for individuals. In ancient times, people knew the trauma of the destruction of the cosmic center, although not the genocide or targeted killings by race, religion, or ethnicity that we are familiar with today. Egypt's traumas may not be as familiar as those of Ur, Babylon, and Jerusalem, but it did experience them. Perhaps the first people who come to mind in inflicting such devastation on the Egyptian psyche derives from Manetho's description of the Hyksos. His depiction castigates them as a most vile people. The thesis of this presentation is that his characterization of the Hyksos is undeserved and better fits the Assyrians. In effect, Manetho retrojected the troubles from the north due to the Assyrian invasion in the 7th century onto the Hyksos in the 17th and in the 16th centuries, due to the political context in the 3rd century BCE in which he wrote. This presentation will introduce these concerns and set the foundation for future exploration of them. So let's start now at the beginning, a very good place to start. Where is the center of the universe? I'm not sure if you can all read this from there, but you can forget about me driving you anywhere until the garage is clean, Jeremy. It's about time that you learn that the universe doesn't revolve around you. And he replies, maybe your universe. So here we see, as a teenager, they know where the center of the world is. They're the center, or at least of the Milky Way, that the world revolves around them. This perception applies to peoples as well as to individuals. This famous New Yorker magazine cover bears a striking resemblance to the image and messages of the previous cartoon. Now the perspective is a city, and not just an individual, but the principle is the same. New Yorkers are well versed in their being the center of the universe, and that the world revolves around them. Consider these quotations from when the phone company dared to introduce the new area code 718 into the world of the New Yorker, who lived on the island at the center of the world. How will 212ers feel if they are unceremoniously dumped and lose what they consider to be the center of the area code universe? How many of you in the audience are part of that 212 universe? Okay, quite a few. And you don't want to be dumped from that. And again, Manhattan is the hub of the universe. I feel we should have our own area code. It should be 111, because we are the hub of the universe. Please be aware that these comments were made by people who had never attended a David O'Connor lecture on cosmos and chaos. But even without the academic jargon, he's an Egyptologist, for those of you, if you may not know who he is. Even without the academic jargon, people have a sense of what it means to be at the center of the universe, and will resist any efforts to be removed from it. This concept of a cosmic center also has a temporal element. In this cartoon, well, it all depends on one's definition of the worldview. And you have Manhattan, Central Park, Broadway, and the Hamptons. What other time zones matter? Space and time can then be combined to create a unity of the space-time continuum and the hope for the next cycle. And we see that here in the New Year celebration at Times Square, crossroads of the universe. So bringing together time and space. Now these ideas were known in ancient time as well. You're looking here at a ziggurat. This happens to be from Uruk, but it could be any of the ones that were built over the millennia in Mesopotamia. This stairway to heaven, the king would ascend it as part of the New Year festival, participate in a sacred marriage, though exactly what happens is still a matter of scholarly dispute, and bring tidings of great joy for the bounties the people were about to receive in the coming year. The spectacle and a feast was witnessed by the people who welcomed the good news. New Yorkers, and indeed all Americans, are familiar with these very ideas. Here we have the king. He's ascended the skyscraper, the building that scrapes the sky, the high place, an unsuccessful attempt to consummate the sacred marriage, and he's fighting the forces of chaos with the polarity reversed over what we might expect. Here the king is the animal from beyond the bounds of the civilized world, and the plains are the products of reason. In this way, it's more like it's Horus smiting the false hippo king, to put it in an Egyptian context. But putting these comedy aside, we know that the cosmic center can also be violated. And this well-known shot here of the firefighters and the American flag at Ground Zero itself is a cosmic center. But in ancient times, they knew the violations and destructions as well of what cities of importance to them. This is the Lament of Ur, in the fall of the dynasty of Ur III to the Elamites, a people from beyond the horizon in the east in modern-day Iran, the forces of chaos, and around the year 2000. And I call your attention, highlighted in red, to the use of the word storm in this lament. See, alas, storm after storm swept the land together, the great storm of heaven, the ever-roaring storm, the malicious storm which swept over the land, the storm which destroyed the cities, the storm which destroyed the houses, the storm which destroyed cow pens, the storm which burned sheepfolds, the storm which cut off all that is good from the land. Even in English, one can feel the cadence of the lament. It's easy to imagine a prophet, a priest, or a mayor after 9/11 rhythmically reading these words to a troubled audience. One should also note that the use of the word storm is in a metaphorical sense. The lament is not a call to search the ancient version of the weather station to locate the meteorological phenomenon which could have wreaked such havoc on the mighty city of Ur. Instead, we should understand the metaphor in reference to the enemy, king, and his army, washing out the existing civilization to create a new world order. The Assyrians would use the deluge terminology to deliver the same message, with the Assyrian king and the army the ones delivering it. And something similar happened in Egypt. The Tempest in the Tempest, the title here comes from my contribution to that upcoming best issue in honor of Dorothea Arnold, and we all look forward to its publication. This article about a stele from the time of Ahmose in the 16th century. Then the gods caused the sky to come in a tempest of rain, with darkness in the western region, the sky being unleashed without cessation, louder than the cries of the masses, more powerful, and there are some gaps, unfortunately, in the text, while the rain raged on the mountains, louder than the noise, the cataract, which is Elephantine, which we'll return to. Every house, every quarter that they reached, floating on the water like skiffs of a papyrus opposite the royal residence, while a torch could not be lit in the two lands. Again, the storm imagery is used. Here, the Hyksos, not the Elamites, are the forces of chaos. And it is Ahmose who has restored Ma'at, the sense of cosmic order on the land, both in the heavens, politically, and cosmically. More well-known one, perhaps, is from the biblical text, the book of Lamentations, following the destruction of the temple in 586. And you'll notice just the parts highlighted in red, we're not going to read the whole thing, that the city here of Jerusalem, identified as a princess among the cities, now a vassal. In the Canaanite tradition carried over to the Bible, cities were female, as in the wife of the male warrior deity who was responsible for protecting it. In this lament, the world has been turned upside down. Instead of Jerusalem being in position of preeminence, it is one of vassalage. Looking also here, highlighted in the red, you can see a critical concern that we're going to be addressing for Egypt as well. the violation of the cosmic center with the nations invading her sanctuary. This is a traumatic event. And finally, as we can see here, expression of geographical awareness of a world encompassing both Egypt and Assyria. This is not Yahweh in the wilderness deity, or Yahweh the deity from Dan to Beersheba, or even Yahweh from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt. All are biblical phrases. Now, Israel and Judah needed to develop a worldview which encompassed a much larger horizon. The exact same would be true for Egypt. So here's Egypt. Truly it was the gift of the Nile. Truly it was the oasis of the ancient Near East, a garden of plenty and abundance amidst a barren wilderness. This is a typical Egyptian landscape where you can see a line literally drawn in the sand separating life and death, where crops can grow and the land where nothing lives. This division carried over into the religion of the Egyptians as well. This is from the Amarna area. These two deities represent the two landscapes with which the Egyptians were most familiar. Despite Set's negative attributes, he is not a figure of evil, the Egyptian Satan. Instead, he was part of the natural flow of Egyptian life. Then something happened that had never happened before. Something unique occurred in the land defined by cycles. The Hyksos arrived. This description by Manetho is reported by Josephus of the Hyksos on their impact on Egypt has become a critical text in the evaluation of Egyptian history and the rise of anti-Semitism. Highlighted in red is Manetho's observation that this despicable event occurred because the superior might of, not because of the superior might of the Hyksos God, but because our God allowed it to happen. It suggests that the Egyptians had done something wrong, and that the path to alleviate the wrongness required the Egyptians to take some unspecified action, so the foreign occupation would end. The Hyksos prowess was undermined by this comment that we didn't lose, but we allowed you to win by not fighting. Although this observation is often taken to mean that the historical Hyksos peacefully entered the land, it also may be construed as, by Manetho, propaganda point, meant to undermine the military legacy of the Hyksos' warriors. In other words, rather than be a bit of historical Hyksos data, it may be a comment on the current political situation. And even though God allowed you to win, and even though we didn't fight you, look, as you can see highlighted here in red, what you did once you took over. You burnt down our cities. You demolished the temples of the gods. You used all the inhabitants after a most barbarous manner. You slew some of them and led their children and their wives into slavery. You made one of yourselves king. You made both the upper and lower regions pay tribute. And you left garrisons in the land. Well, maybe not quite ISIS, but not a pretty picture nonetheless. Now let's look at what the historical Hyksos really did compared to Manetho's version of them. First, the Hyksos ruled from Egypt. The Assyrians, the Persians, and the Romans would not after their conquest. The Hyksos ruled from ARCE. Second, the Hyksos adopted Egyptian royal titulary. They did not rule as Caesar. They ruled as Pharaoh, just as native-born Egyptians did before them and would after them. Third, the Hyksos became part of the Egyptian dynastic tradition, including the very tradition created by Manetho that we still use in general today, which includes the Hyksos in multiple dynasties and not just the 15th. This is not true of the Assyrians, who we'll be coming to. 4, the Hyksos became part of the Egyptian social fabric. Hyksos vocabulary, military practices, and technology became part of the Egyptian culture. I suspect that Apparel in the time of Amenhotep III and IV in the 14th century was an assimilated Hyksos. Both he and his son held positions of prominence in the chariotry, and if he is Semitic, it's hard to see what else he could have been other than an assimilated Hyksos. This pattern continued in general with the Libyans and the Nubians when they joined these Canaanites as rulers of Egypt later in the first millennium BCE. Turning now to the 19th dynasty, the fallacy of Manetho's description I previously read becomes even clearer. The Hyksos capital of ARCE became the capital for this delta-based chariotry dynasty, who may have had close ties to the Hyksos. It has even been speculated that the Ramessides themselves may have had some Hyksos ancestry. The founding of the Hyksos capital was recognized by Ramses II in the 400-year stele. Set and Baal still were not figures of evil as they would become later in the first millennium BCE. Obviously, with kings named after Set and a princess named after Anat, Canaanite goddess, the Canaanite culture was not held in disregard. The point of these observations is there was no Hyksos trauma legacy from the second millennium BCE, meaning there was no trauma that the Hyksos induced on the Egyptians that they carried forth with them year after year, decade after decade, century after century into the first millennium and the time when Manetho wrote. Therefore, any attempt to understand his description of the Hyksos as the continuation of a long-standing legacy of trauma induced into the Egyptian culture by the Hyksos is wrong. The source of Manetho's description of the traumatic violation of the Egyptian cosmos by an outsider needs to be found elsewhere. That somewhere else is Assyria. Assyria, too, had its traditions of being the cosmic center, of being the center of the world and ruling the four quarters of the universe, a standard Mesopotamian phrase for universal rule by a king. This map shows some of these cosmic centers. And you can see here Nineveh, Ashur, and Khorsabad. But this would also raise a problem. Where is the cosmic center in a multi-cosmic world? There can only be one cosmic center of the universe at a time. As long as Rome and the Middle Kingdom, China, were thousands of miles apart, with only the most tenuous connection between them, each could bask in the certainty that they were the masters of their domain. On the other hand, today the world is interconnected, easily traversed, and linked by instantaneous communication. In such a world, the Middle Kingdom, the Caliphate, and the city on a hill offer three different and incompatible perspectives. There's no guarantee that New York will remain the cosmic center for the world indefinitely, that the United Nations will remain located here. If a change occurs, even if peacefully, it will be far more traumatic for the city than simply losing a 212 area code or even 9/11. What I want to suggest is that something similar happened in ancient times. As far as Egypt had been concerned, what happened in Assyria stayed in Assyria. It didn't matter what Assyria did, since it had no impact on Egypt's perception of itself as the center of the universe. And then what Assyria did do did start to matter to the Egyptians. With Ashurnazirpal II, the situation changes. The stakes become more serious for everyone in the ancient Near East. He broadcast this dawn of a new era with what I like to call the first Summer Olympics, or World Exposition, only with overtones of the 1936 Games in Berlin. Now focus just on the red part in the highlighted here, and don't try to read the entire inscription. In 879, Ashurbanipal invited the world to his cosmic center at Qalal, and the world attended. The numbers highlighted in red attest big numbers of people, big numbers of days, big amounts of food. This celebration at Qalal, which you see here on the screen, was a massive undertaking where Ashurbanipal put the world on notice. We are coming after you. Be afraid. Be very afraid. There is some speculation that the political marriage arranged by Omri of Israel and Ethbal of Sidon between Ahab and Jezebel might have been one of the responses to this message. Ahab would figure in the looming battle with Assyria, as would Egypt. And that would occur during the reign of Shalmaneser III, the son of Ashurnasirpal II. This would be the first contact between the military forces of these two countries. It was at the Battle of Qarqar in 853 BCE. And the Assyrians moved west. The coalition of the willing moved north, and the confrontation in what today would be Syria was at Qarqar. You can see in this coalition, among a variety of people like Ahab, there were 1,000 troops of Egypt. This made it a junior partner in a fight a long way from Egypt, and in a battle that did not directly threaten it. This shows that Egypt understood the long-term danger that Assyria posed to it. Assyrian expansion slowed down after Shalmaneser III, and it was not until Tiglath-Pileser III, over a century later, became king, that it was vigorously renewed. He successfully marched into Israel, redrawing the boundaries of the kingdom there, and proceeded to the border with Egypt without actually crossing over and attacking it. Sargon II, Egypt comes face to face with Assyria and loses, but still not in Egypt proper. The confrontation is on lands that Egypt regards as its own, but not in the Nile Valley. Sargon develops a fearsome reputation. His death on the battlefield in 705, without his body being recovered, sends a joyous shockwave throughout the ancient Near East. People begin to think they can successfully rebel against Assyrian rule. Those hopes are denied. Sennacherib succeeds his father and has to deal with the consequences of why Ashur allowed Sargon to die such an ignominious death without honor. He followed in his father's footsteps by creating his own cosmic center. He builds the palace without rival at Nineveh. This early world wonder has been proposed as the basis for the famed Hanging Gardens attributed to Babylon. The stakes are raised in the confrontation between Egypt and Assyria. Sennacherib prevails, but the body is still fought away from Egypt proper and not in the Nile Valley. And you can see that here on the map where it's all the way up here. Still, the threat has come nearer and nearer to Egypt, and it is reasonable to conclude that eventually the fight will cross over into Egypt, which is exactly what happens. His son Esarhaddon succeeds him, and he crosses that line. During the 670s, Esarhaddon and Taharqa go back and forth, with the Assyrian triumphing and the Kushite king forced to flee south. The key item here, highlighted in red, is that Memphis is sacked. The capital is sacked, violated. And you can see in the red highlighted at the bottom, I destroyed it. I tore down its walls. I burned it down. And the worst was yet to come for Egypt. Turning now to his son, who rules for a long period. In 667-666, Ashurbanipal invades Egypt. He reinstalls the local leaders whom his father had installed and whom Taharqa had deposed when he temporarily regained power. In 663, he returns to Egypt following the death of Taharqa, and now he sacks Thebes. And here I'm calling it Egypt's 9/11. Again, looking at just the part highlighted in red, he has taken the doors of the temples I tore from their bases and carried off to Assyria. And where did he carry it off to? Nineveh. Now Egypt is faced with the same problem that Jonah had to face, that Nineveh is really the cosmic center of the universe, not you. Some of his captives even included those who become the founders of the 26th dynasty, the Saite dynasty. So this was quite a reversal for Egypt over what it had been used to. This recap of Assyrian imperialism and its conflicts with Egypt over these few decades tell the story of how the Egyptian life now came to be dominated by Assyria. Where was it? How close was it? When was it going to invade? What would it do when it finally arrived? And the consequences were dire for Egypt. All this back and forth between the Nubians and the Syrians in the land of Egypt might make for a good opera. If someone wanted to tell a good story to music. Assyria did not rule for long, but its impact was substantial. And quoting now from a few Egyptologists, what then took place was an event that had been totally inconceivable for over 1,500 years. And since he's writing about an event in the 660s, 1,500 years earlier was in the 22nd century BCE, long before the Hyksos arrived in the 16th and 15th. So he is not considering them the forces of chaos and trauma that the Assyrians are. Thebes was sacked by invaders, burnt, ravaged, and all its temples pillaged, treasures pillaged. The cosmic center had been violated. Egypt had experienced what Babylon had once again by Sennacherib in 689 BCE and what Judah would in 586 BCE. And doesn't the language here remind you a little bit of Manetho's description of what he claimed the Hyksos had done? In case you're not sure, I will be showing that slide again, and we'll see that it does. He goes on to write, time was also running out for the whole of Egyptian civilization, now that the myth of the inviolability of Pharaoh's sanctuaries had been destroyed by the barbarous forces of the East, who from then on struck terror into all the peoples, from Asia Minor to the banks of the Niles. This is the exact same issue Judah would face when its sanctuary, which survived Sennacherib in 701 and was thought to be inviolable, was then unceremoniously sacked by Nebuchadnezzar II in 586 BCE. This is an issue all the peoples faced during this time of imperialism. And another scholar, Jan Assmann, for the first time in its long history, Thebes was conquered, plundered, and reduced to ashes. He expresses similar observations about the shock of the Assyrians turning the Egyptian national sanctuary to ash. This is an unprecedented violation for Egypt. It had never occurred before. And now a third Egyptologist, this one here, as you see highlighted in red, introduces the term trauma to describe the Egyptian reaction to it. Other cultures had dealt with the Ark of Shiloh being captured or the statue of Marduk being removed from Babylon, but millennia-old Egypt had avoided this fate so far. If anything, the Hyksos, the Libyans, the Nubians had acculturated to Egyptian ways, and sometimes seemed even more devoted to the Egyptian way than the Egyptians themselves. This was not the case with Assyria. which paid no respect to the Egyptian way of life, even as it produced objects which could be relocated to the true cosmic center now in Nineveh. He goes on again to use the word trauma or traumatic here. It's a frequently used term by Ryholt in his writings about this time period. This imagery is very reminiscent of that of the Lament of Ur. He also focuses on the literature which was produced following this trauma. While the Egyptian stories cited here by Ryholt are outside the scope of this paper, and a topic in their own right, one can note just from the titles the interest in Assyria and the introduction of mythical motifs. And when they infer a desire for a savior who will free the people from foreign rule, restore the monuments and temples, and revive the good old days when Egypt was the center of the universe. It is now time to reread Manetho's description of the Hyksos invasion, where we can see how closely it correlates with the actions of the Assyrians. Burnt down our cities, demolished the temples of the gods, used the inhabitants in a most barbarous way. Nay, some they slew and led their children and wives into slavery. At length they made one of themselves king, made both upper and lower Egypt regions pay tribute, and left garrisons. And the Assyrians did not make one of their own king, but they did create the Saite dynasty from captives they had taken into Assyria. The garrisons in the land referred to the next trauma. Egypt could have survived the Assyrian violation of the land and the sacking of its national sanctuaries without a deep-seated, long-lasting trauma. Shortly after Ashurbanipal invaded the land, Assyria began a period of decline. Maintaining the empire became more and more of a challenge. By the time he died in 627, the Assyrian Empire was on its last legs and headed for oblivion. The prophet Nahum compared the collapse of Nineveh in 612 BCE to that of Thebes about 50 years earlier at the hands of the Assyrians. The biblical passage you see on the right reflects the new world order being created with a renewed Egypt. In the days of Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh Necho slew him at Megiddo when he saw him. It shows Egypt in alliance with Assyria by 609 BCE. It shows Egypt back in the land of Canaan over 500 years after Ramses VI withdrew and ended the era of New Kingdom Egyptian imperialism there. Since then, save for a one-time raid by Sheshonq in the 10th century BCE and passing through on the way to Qarqar in the 9th century BCE that I previously spoke about, Egypt's direct military presence in the land had been minimal. Now it was back, just like the good old days. And in the passage on the right, you see it's about Pharaoh's intervention into the dynastic heritage and the king ruling in the land of Judah in the city of Jerusalem. It shows Pharaoh manipulating the dynasty and putting the person he wants in charge, taxing the land, extracting silver and gold from the land, essentially reasserting the old Egyptian imperialism we know from the late Bronze Age. This biblical passage reveals Egyptian involvement reminiscent of the glory days. Now it was interfering in local dynastic rule and extracting tribute from an obedient vassal. How sweet it was. But that glory didn't last long. Nebuchadnezzar I triumphs over the combined forces of Egypt and Assyria here in 605 BCE. Egypt's efforts to staunch the decline of Assyria fail, and soon Assyria disappears as a viable entity. In virtual oblivion until the excavations in the 1840s begin to bring the Assyrian legacy back to life. Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Egypt in 601 BCE fails, and Babylonia never does conquer Egypt. After a respite of 75 years, the Saite Renaissance is curtailed. That is, this revival of Old Kingdom traditions, of long-standing Egyptian culture, comes to an end when Cambyses in 525 BCE, who you see on the right, successfully invades the land, defeating Psammetichus III, who is the figure kneeling before him here. Cambyses and Psammetichus III. For roughly the next 2 centuries, Egypt, on and off, would be ruled by Persia. Trauma number 2. Now we can turn to the garrisons in Manetho's descriptions of the Hyksos, which are really more an attribute of the longer Persian rule than the short Assyrian rule. We have to backtrack slightly to understand who were in these garrisons. The Jews, or more appropriately the Judeans and the Israelites, appear to have entered the land during the reign of Psammetichus I. The northern kingdom of Israel had been destroyed in 722 by Assyria, and some of its military forces had been incorporated into the Assyrian army. Judah had been ravaged by Sennacherib in 701, but it still stood. Indeed, during the reign of Manasseh in the 7th century, concurrent with the beginning of the reign of Psammetichus, the kingdom of Judah was doing all right. At this point, Egypt seemed open to a variety of peoples who would assist in the effort to free the country of foreign rule, little knowing that Assyria was about to collapse. Although Babylonia did not succeed in conquering Egypt, it effectively precluded an Egyptian return to the Levant as an imperial power. Egypt was now united, but it had some unfinished business with the Nubians. Psammetichus II led a successful invasion deep upstream in Nubia, doing to the Nubians what the Assyrians had done to it, sacking cities, looting temples, destroying images. A Greek graffito at Abu Simbel says, when Psammetichus came to Elephantine, this was written by those who sailed with Psammetichus. This locates Pharaoh at a site that would become critical shortly. So far, the Jews seem likely to still have been allies of the Egyptians, along with various other peoples. But that would change. The issue facing them were Jews had a different perception of the Persians than did the Egyptians. The Jewish attitude was different. Cyrus the Great in 539 permitted the exiles in Babylonia to return to Judah. In effect, he had become a savior, like Nebuchadnezzar I and David had been for their respective peoples, by champion restorations. The Cyrus cylinder, recently at the Met, signifies this policy and provides a backdrop to the biblical characterization that you see on the left of your screen. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, or to his Messiah, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to ungird the loins of kings, to open the doors before him, that gates may not be closed. Thus, the attitude of the Jewish mercenaries in Egypt, who had been acting on behalf of Egypt for over a century, was a positive one towards the Persians between 539 and 525, when the Persians conquered Egypt. That conquest led to a dramatic change. And you're looking here at the right at some of the papyrus that was found at the city of Elephantine. The Egyptian hatred of the Persians, which may be exaggerated at times, wasn't only directed against them, but to the people in the land who now functioned as representatives of the Persians. We know from these papyrus discoveries that the Jews were established as a garrison force there prior to the Persian conquest. We know that the Persians destroyed Egyptian temples, but not the Jewish one. We know that the Jews celebrated Passover, the festival remembering the deliverance from Egypt at the hand of Yahweh. We know from the Passover letter papyrus dated 419 BCE that they celebrated Passover with the blessing of the Persian king. We know that the Jews were monotheists or a close facsimile. And we know that the Jews switched allegiances from Pharaoh to Persia, including when the Egyptians rebelled against Persian rule. Undoubtedly, these are the garrisons Manetho was referring to in his description of the Hyksos. The tensions between the local Egyptian population and the Jewish garrison during the time of the Persians was intense. Finally, it exploded in 410 BCE in riots. This was a premeditated act timed by the Egyptians to the absence of the Persian governor. The event has been called the first religious conflict, as you see in this excerpt on the screen. We do not have any evidence of a religious conflict prior to the Persian conquest of Egypt. Whatever term one chooses to designate the events in Elephantine, there cannot be any doubt that the first time in history that an anti-Jewish outburst becomes evident is about 410 BCE in the colony of Elephantine. After the successful Persian conquest of Egypt, the Egyptians had to deal with multiple traumas. The invasion from the north was becoming a recurring pattern, with foreign rulers not ruling as local pharaohs, but from afar. Former allies had changed sides. All this required answers and explanations, so the Egyptians developed one. Egypt retrojected its present to create an imagined past. Egypt created a pattern of destruction retrojected to the Hyksos. Egypt retrojected its religious animosity to the Jews to Akhenaten. Egypt created the desire to cleanse the land of lepers, the lowest of the low in the ancient Near East. So God would no longer be averse to Egypt, and it would be free. Once one realizes that the answers the Egyptians developed were products of the current time period and not deep-seated, long-lasting traumatic legacies from the second millennium BCE, a different perspective emerges. The Hyksos and Akhenaten are not the source of the anti-Hyksos, anti-monotheism in Assyrian and Persian times. Assyria, Persia, and the Jews joining the Persian side are reinterpreted, particularly in the Jewish case, through the Hyksos and Akhenaten experiences. Manetho's anti-Semitism was not due to the Hyksos and Akhenaten, but was explained through them. Jan Asmann's position, you see written here, is what I want to show is that the recollection of Akhenaten's revolution, which were banned from official historical memory, survived in some form of traumatic memory. By this he means a continual memory from the time of Akhenaten in the 14th century to the time in the 3rd century when Manetho wrote, not only directly about the Hyksos, but about the Exodus as well. What I have suggested in this talk is that there was no ongoing trauma and hatred from the second millennium BCE. Instead, the traumas in the first millennium BCE became triggers to search the past for precedents and explanations. To substantiate that assertion requires additional research involving tracing the transformation of Set and Baal from being part of the Egyptian cultural experience in the second millennium to being evil deities in the first millennium. To examine the savior stories of Egyptian nationalist propaganda. meaning the stories they wrote in the time of particularly Persian rule and partially Assyrian rule, where they were seeking independence to be free from foreign rule. To examine the Exodus stories in Egyptian and Greek traditions, particularly by Manetho, where these stories seem to suggest some kind of link to the Hyksos and to Akhenaten. And to determine when and how the anti-foreign nationalist stories became attached to the Hyksos and the Jews as villains. By doing this, I think we will come to a better understanding of the origins of anti-Semitism, not just in Egypt, but essentially in the world, as a product of this period during Persian domination and the writings of the Egyptians to explain and deal with that. In the beginning, God planted a garden, and a river flowed to water the garden, and it was the gift of the Nile, the center of the universe, and it was good. Then came the kings from the east, and the Egyptian world would never be the center of the universe again. And they hated those they thought responsible for that. Thank you. The Greeks accelerate the process. They are very much part of the anti-Semitic story. There's no doubt about it. They have very clear and distinct views about their role in the world, their culture, their superiority, and they very definitely look down on others. After the Ptolemies take over, there is an intense fight in Alexandria in particular, where you have the Greeks and the Jews and the Egyptians, of course, living together in a city created by the Greeks, with issues over citizenship. And at that point, they take the anti-Semitism that already had existed and bring it to a higher level. Now, you can make a case, if you want, that a lot of the objections of the Egyptians was anti-Judah and not anti-Semitic. And some of the scholars do that. What I mean by that is you have power rivalries. You have different countries fighting with each other, not necessarily over any ideological difference, but just because, well, that's what countries do. And that they hadn't reached the intense level that they would under the Greeks. But you're quite right to point out that it was worse then. What I'm trying to suggest in the research that needs to be done is we need to trace that through. I don't think Manetho created it. I think he inherited a lot of it. And he may have put the pieces together to formulate it, or at least that's who Josephus turns to. But I do not see him necessarily as the originator of it, as much as an inheritor of an older tradition going back to Persian times. And that would be part of the further research that I need to do. Cyrus, as I said, if you look in the biblical text, he's called the Messiah. I mean, that's the word the biblical texts use. When he permits the Jews to return from exile in Babylon in 539, that's a tremendous event. They rebuild the temple beginning 20 years later. You have the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are both very welcome to Persia, even Esther much later on. So you don't really find any anti-Persian elements in the biblical tradition, in the Jewish tradition. And that, I'm suggesting, carries over to the Jews who happen to be stationed in Egypt. They too. Well, the Jews in Elephantine wrote letters back to Jerusalem and Samaria, and that's part of what's found in the papyrus that are there. So we know they're in direct communication with what's going on in the 5th century. Now, how much totally they're aware, we can't know, but even so, they would have heard from the Persian governors in the land of Egypt. They would have heard things from them as well. So basically, Jews and Persians had a good relationship throughout the duration of the Persian Empire. Jews and Egyptians had a good relationship during the Assyrian Empire because Assyria was a mutual enemy. But then in 525, I'm suggesting that's when the change began. Egypt became anti-Persian. The Jews in Egypt did not. The fact that the Jews supported the Persians in and of itself is one issue that would have driven the Egyptians upset. But the fact that they then celebrated Passover, which was a celebration of leaving Egypt, they did so with the Persian blessing and opposition to some of the local temples in the city there, which helped lead to the riot, and then the monotheism, which is very different. But we have to understand also, even with the monotheism, I don't want to overdo that, all of these countries back then were headed towards some kind of single God rule. As you start to rule the whole world, and not just a city where you're aware of another city worshiping another god, but you can see it even with Marduk and Ashur. They begin to absorb characteristics of other deities. And even though those deities don't disappear, clearly Ashur is number one, clearly Marduk is number one, and so forth. So you don't necessarily get rid of them all, but still the tendency is to look at one and not a whole multiplicity of deities. But that wouldn't have helped them. Being monotheistic wouldn't have helped. When you have temples to other Egyptian gods located right near the Jewish temple at this site. Well, thank you very much.